Now I'd like to introduce my friend Jeff Musson. He is going to take us into the world of Canada-US technology, but also the shared ecosystem that we've got. Jeff has done a fantastic job with many of his initiatives, such as North of 41 and Tech Day on Parliament Hill, in bringing a better understanding to policymakers and to regulators of how technology can really assist them in moving their initiatives along. So, Jeff, I can hand this panel over to you.
Perfect. Just a little bit of background on myself. I own a company called DynamiteNetwork.com. We develop software and specifically have started to specialize in developing software and apps for automotive cars. But what has sort of brought me into this cross-border ecosystem is that I guess it's about 5 years ago, I formed a tech networking group called North of 41. And the sole mission was to connect tech entrepreneurs across North America. And we've done various entrepreneur exchanges between Chicago and Toronto and New York and Toronto, in addition to hosting Tech Day on Parliament Hill. And we actually did the second annual Tech Day on the Hill 2 weeks ago and had over 225 MPs and staffers. So that's a little background on myself, and we've got a great panel here to talk about technology trends and where things are going and how can it apply to the US-Canada relationship. So I'm going to let each one of these guys introduce themselves, and then we'll get going. Start off.
Sure. Happy to start. Ryan Eckmeyer, Senior Director of Public Affairs at GS1 Canada. For those who aren't familiar with GS1, the very short elevator speech is we are the issuer of barcode standards worldwide. So different from CSA, who's also a standards organization, we uniquely identify things. So products would be the one that you're most familiar with, but we also identify locations, assets, shipments, movements, basically anything along a traditional supply chain. Our world is really that mushy middle between industry, government, and even we split out industry a little bit between trading partners. So we are fundamentally we're a data company, a not-for-profit, industry-led organization that seeks to solve non-competitive issues amongst industry players. The best example would be point of sale at a grocery store. That was really the original use of the barcode. That's an issue that every grocery retailer, every retailer in the world faced, finding an efficient way to check people out in a store. And we've since taken that concept over the last 42, 43 years and taken it into new sectors. So our work in Canada is basically any type of product, any type of consumer product that would have a barcode in it. We try to take the data behind the scenes and find new uses for it. And I'll talk a little bit about the border environment and how we're trying to use it in a few minutes.
So Rohit Shankar, I'm the CEO of Innovex. We're a software engineering company based out of Oakville, which is just outside of Toronto. So my personal background is that I've actually lived almost a third of my life in 3 different countries. I was born in India. I actually grew up right here in the US in another university town in Missouri, Columbia, Missouri. And I moved to Canada just before I started my own university. And I've been settled up there ever since. Another thing, right after I finished school, I had a privilege of actually working internationally. So I actually got to see some of the nuances that you don't necessarily see as an engineer that actually impede product development and getting things out into the market. So I'm going to speak to that a little bit later on. The other thing that's actually been mentioned up here has been this whole notion of, all the tech being around, things like Snapchat or Twitter and things like that, things that are very consumer facing. And a lot of that stuff is cool. It gets a lot of publicity, makes the tech blog sphere and things like that. But most of the problems are not actually in that domain. They're actually, like the last speaker was mentioning in the panel before that, just before lunch, were around manufacturing and things like that. So our motivation has always been to become a very good digital product development agency that works with domain experts and actually helps them to continuously evolve. That's actually what Innovex's core mission is. And over the last few years, over the last 5 years, we've penetrated the transportation and the healthcare sectors. So I'll speak to that a little bit more later on.
My name is Ahmed Nasri. I am a technologist by trade. I'm a software developer at heart. I'm a Canadian that works for an American company. It's a startup in San Francisco called S.A.G.E. We build API technology and products and services that are used by other software developers to build APIs and build technology around their APIs. API stands for Application Programming Interface, for those ones who are not familiar with that term. And it's essentially the data in which software communicates with each other and systems share information with each other. We service different number of clients across multiple sectors, from government, financial, to healthcare. For us, it's all the same technology. It's all the same services that we offer. But for our clients and for our users, they use the products and services that we build to create those kind of interactions between the software systems and the products that they sell and create. So it's an interesting experience for me to be here because I am a Canadian who lives in Canada, but I work for a US company, and our clients are spread between both sides of the border as well as globally as well. So for me, my focus is mostly on the engineering side. I lead a global engineering team. We have employees who are both Canadian, American, a number of cities in both countries, but also in Europe as well. And there's certainly a lot of challenges for us in terms of not only delivering technology solutions that work across different legalities and borders and privacy concerns, because we are talking about data and data that is potentially used for personal records or healthcare systems, but also in terms of how do we manage employee relationships, how do we attract the right talent from both sides of the borders.
I'm Zach Lawrence. I'm president of Venture Corp Dev, which is a strategy and finance consulting firm where I provide critical stage advisory services to help privately held high growth companies protect, enhance, and convert their strategic value. I'm also an entrepreneur in residence with Tech Growth Ohio, which is a public-private venture development organization and seed fund manager. In a past life, I helped manage the Ohio Tech Angel Funds, which is a group of four for-profit angel investor funds which invest in software, life sciences, advanced materials, and sensors and instruments companies that's based here in Columbus, Ohio, and it is managed by Rev1 Ventures. I've been lucky enough to see some portfolio companies and some clients enjoy the benefits of beautiful cross-border partnerships, and glad to be a part of this panel.
Perfect. So I also want to make this an interactive discussion. So if anyone has any questions throughout, we're not going to wait till the end. You can just put up your hand and we'll answer them. An interesting stat that not too many people know is that there's over 350,000 Canadians in Silicon Valley. That's a sizable contingent of Canadians. As much as we talk about Kitchener-Waterloo, Toronto, New York, LA, even here in Columbus having being a center of innovation, I want to ask a couple of you guys, and maybe I'll start with Rohit. Is any area going to knock off Silicon Valley as being number one?
No.
And why?
I mean, Silicon Valley has a deep history from, going back in the World War II days, I think, when they had to ship every intelligent person to the West Coast. So the ecosystem that was born at that time and the motivation for that genesis for that entire ecosystem was completely different than the world in which we live today. Today, their ecosystem has matured over half a century, and it's accelerating at a pretty incredible pace. Their collaboration between the VCs and the innovators and even policymakers is absolutely astounding. I think that these other ecosystems that you mentioned should definitely take some lessons learned from that and implement it faster, but I don't necessarily think Toronto or New York or any of these areas is going to take over Silicon Valley in the next 50
But basically
years.
sort of complement. Someone
Correct.
else want to chime in on their thoughts?
I would say that's a good question, but I don't think it's a full question. To me, the question is either is places like Waterloo and different economies and kind of communities will surpass Silicon Valley in terms of business. I think I would agree with you. The answer is no. If we are talking about technology, innovation, or creativity in general, I think Silicon Valley is actually behind. In fact, a lot of the technologies, and specifically in the terms of software and wearable computing, a lot of the hardware and IoT startups that we're seeing, a lot of the core technologies that are being created and leveraged in Silicon Valley have actually come from Waterloo and mostly Toronto and Waterloo, Kitchener-Waterloo region. The core innovation, the scientific kind of side of it, did start there. And from my perspective, that's where Silicon Valley is lacking behind right now. They are certainly more innovative in terms of what we were talking about earlier in the panel, actually taking that scientific approach, taking those discoveries, taking the software kind of technologies that are being created and building successful businesses out of them. So I think it's a two-part question to me.
And I'll just add, I think your question, no. Kitchener-Waterloo will never be Palo Alto. It'll never have the weather patterns. It'll never have the self-driving cars and that kind of altruistic. You can do anything you want here, but they don't have to be. They can be their own hub. Now we're talking about it on a much smaller scale, quite literally with University of Waterloo taking over all the former BlackBerry buildings. You're really talking a single building in Kitchener that's acting as your innovation hub. And it's, not to discredit the work they're doing, because they're really doing some neat stuff there. They have, incubation programs for new startup companies all the way through their level of maturity. So they don't have to be. They don't have to do exactly what they're doing in California. They can do their own thing, but they need to find ways to commercialize, to take these companies from idea to concept to actual commercialization, and then they'll find their own niche in the marketplace.
No, that's fair enough. Zach, I want to sort of get your opinion and sort of bring it down now another level. What are the hot trends in technology, since you're on the investment side, in 2016? I mean, we've got Internet of Things, we've got big data. Where are you seeing trends?
Sure. Those are definitely a couple areas. I'd say, kind of talking about big data is maybe a little bit of a misnomer because it's such an underpinning of so many different industries. It's like, talking about software, so many different industries rely on software. It's really hard to
so explain to the audience what big data is and even the Internet of Things, right?
Well, I saw a wonderful comic once about big data, and essentially it said big data, people talking about big data is kind of like middle schoolers talking about sex. Everyone's talking about it, but no one really knows what they're doing with it. And but really it's the idea that, in any industry by collecting and warehousing data, whether it's industry data, internal company data, geopolitical, you name it. You can analyze that data and find different regressions and different trend data and patterns within larger sets of data, and hopefully use that information to identify specific facts or specific trends, but also, who knows, maybe get a little bit better at predicting the future.
Oh, for sure. So picking up on that with business intelligence, Rohit, you want to sort of comment on,
Sure.
business intelligence, and why does it matter to this crowd here?
Yeah, I mean, just like you said, I mean, there are a lot of buzzwords that get thrown around. The notion of business intelligence has been around as long as humanity's been around. We all make decisions based on some sort of intelligence. We process it. So, fundamentally, it's just the notion of the acquisition, storage, analysis, and eventually a decision based on studying your processes, your business processes, and things like that. Big data plays a key role in that, but one of the things that I'd like to highlight again is that big data and business intelligence, they've been around for quite some time. And it's not in the scientific community or the engineering community that we're having these problems, right? I mean, we've had jet fighters that have been flying for quite some time. And if you want to talk about a big data, sort of a control systems problem, that is a real big data application. You have to analyze a whole bunch of things in real time and make incredibly important decisions. Businesses, as much as we might like to think they fly as fast as jet fighters, they don't. So business intelligence a lot of times comes down to how you're thinking about the next major decision you have to make, or which decisions are you prioritizing. A couple times I heard up here that it's really hard to prioritize which decision or which problem to solve. Well, if you're having that problem, you're running out of time. So one of the things is that we're not time boxing some of these important decisions that we have to make. And on the ground, what we're struggling with is a lot of people want this stuff, they want the business intelligence, but they're not time boxing by when they want it. And that's not getting people aligned up and down the food chain to actually come to that. So that's kind of my take on the whole business intelligence motion.
Yeah, for sure. So did you want to comment? No. Okay. So in talking about business intelligence, it can help ease the flow of goods across the border. It can streamline processes. Can you talk about a couple of examples that your software has been working on a municipal level?
Sure. I mean, in transportation, there was an amazing panel here by I think a gentleman from the University of Windsor was hosting. There are numerous problems that can be solved, and again, in the scientific and engineering communities, we know the nature of scientific revolutions. It's not a big bang that sets everything in motion all at once. So, I mean, we're doing very little things on the ground, like working with telematics companies that have hardware devices plugged into fleets that are able to send geospatial data into the cloud. And we're able to take that data and integrate it with work management systems and actually show, how well is your fleet performing. Are you able to hit kind of your target times to completion for your job orders in a day? What's causing you to be late at a job site? Things like that. So again, these are all questions that operators, managers, business owners, they all care about.
Importers, exporters.
Importers, exporters, exactly. I mean, one of the key things I heard on the panel was, we actually have a theoretical mechanism for getting a truck across the border from Windsor to Detroit in 34 seconds. If we don't do that, then we're actually taking what's a 1 kilometer border and stretching it to 100 kilometers. That should be on every website that has anything to do with borders. I mean, that is the fundamental issue, right? So again, like the problems are very, very simple. They have theoretical and proven sort of academic solutions, but it's getting stuck in the kind of muck.
Policy weeds and everything
Policy
else,
weeds,
right?
management, within corporations, and it's, I didn't have any white hair until I started my organization. I thought it was going to be very easy, and I'm graying fast.
So what was interesting was earlier this year, our group North of 41 partnered with Dickinson Wright in the U.S. Chamber, and we actually hosted one of the first ever cross-border hackathons. And the whole premise on this was to, and Dan talked about it last night at dinner, was to get a bunch of us geeks in the room, and I think there were over 200 of us in Chicago and Toronto, and see what kind of creative solutions could come to the table. And one of the areas that we focused on was API development, because there are systems already out there in industry that can be very easily applied to helping to solve the cross-border issues. So, Ahmed, you want to talk, because you guys really specialize in API development, and why are APIs important, and how is it going to change these people's lives?
So the fundamental technology that drives the value chain behind APIs is very simple. It's not as in need of standardization and policy and regulation as many other technologies might be, especially when you're talking about cross-border collaboration. But the challenge is in actually producing these APIs, you fall into the policy traps, you fall into the regulation requirements, you fall into the standardization challenges. You just mentioned a keyword there that you probably didn't notice. You said kilometers, but that doesn't work on this side of the border. So when you have a big data problem, when you have solutions and systems that are able to solve these challenges for businesses, but then you want to actually take those learnings and those lessons and apply them to different demographics, different municipalities, different countries, immediately you have, first of all, things as simple as conversion for unit systems. Sure, that's a solved problem, but but there's no standardization behind it. There's no policy that governs it. There's no requirements that tell you as a business need to follow the following regulations. At least it's not very well defined. The other side of it is there are no, at least easy standards or easily accessible standards for privacy concerns and understanding what we might deem in Canada as safe and okay information to share with the audience based on our user bases versus what you might have to deal with on the US side of things. So for APIs, they're really facilitating those sort of interactions. The tooling and the technology is just allowing businesses to actually be able to transfer information, to create as much access or as little access as possible to this type of data, solving whether it's big data problems or it's business intelligence problems. You still need to share that data somehow, and then you need to have some control and some access to policy governance over this data. You can't do that by sharing databases. You don't do that by sharing Excel spreadsheets or printed papers of information. You have to do that through digital format, and the digital format is APIs. There are no other alternative. That is how the entire internet works. That's how the cloud works. That's how all software technologies work today. So the problems we're trying to solve, at least in MashApe, is providing the right tooling and the level of flexibility that engineers can use to actually go ahead and build these solutions. And what we're seeing from working with, for example, the US government is a client of ours. The healthcare program uses our tools. I was saying an example earlier where we have a company here in the US that is part of the tooling chain that's responsible for printing your driver's licenses. I don't know in how many states exactly, but in the majority of the states, they're part of that tool chain that ends up printing your plastic driver license that you keep in your pocket. Well, that company is a US company. They use technology built by companies in Europe, companies in Canada, companies in the US, and other places. The relationship that we established, a cross-border relationship, just to build a software technology that eventually leads to a plastic card in your pocket. That's a lot of regulation, that's a lot of information, that's a lot of things that have to be shared. And the only way you can share that is by having an open program where APIs are allowing this data to flow through and these companies to thrive.
Hey, I'd like to tag on with that. Those are great points. I think to kind of bring it down to a local level and a cross-border level, there's a portfolio company of mine, N-Channel Incorporated, which is a software platform which helps multi-channel retailers use the cloud to integrate their point of sale, their inventory systems, their e-commerce operations, and their accounting systems. And they wouldn't be able to exist without some of the standardization that's taken place over the last 10 years with APIs and integration resources. And it's kind of interesting, they just announced, to tie it to the cross-border angle, they just announced last week in conjunction with Shopify, one of the fastest growing Canadian companies, and I think the biggest IPO in Canada last year. They just announced last week that they're going to be an exclusive partner to help folks who are moving over from Magento, which is a former eBay subsidiary e-commerce platform, who want to migrate over from Magento to Shopify. Can do it really with a flip of a switch, using N-Channel software, which relies on some of the standardization of APIs and integrators. And without this kind of resource, it not only helps both of those companies win market share and that sort of thing and gain revenue, it also allows a lot of, from small scale multi-channel retailers to huge ones to sell into bigger markets and increase their market share without having to bring on a whole team of developers or go in and do a several $1 million custom development operation to migrate this data. It can really be done with a flip of a switch now due to these advances.
And that's really a brand new market sector in itself. Companies like Shopify and Magento are competitors. They're not going to come together and say, okay, let's standardize our data, let's standardize our format, and share it openly so that our customers can switch back and forth. That's just never going to happen. There might be in other scenarios interest of standardization around e-commerce technology, but in this case, they are direct competitors. They're not going to do that. However, each of those companies have open data and open APIs, and they allow access for developers to come into their platform and leverage those APIs to create solutions. The idea there is that their own business can benefit from that because now there's more solutions beyond the core focus of the two companies. And this is the example now. You have integration businesses now sprawling out that they can take the users of one platform and help them go to the next platform at no cost to other platforms, but to the benefit of the user and creating a new market opportunity for these kind of integrations.
And that's able to sort of help not only in cross-border, importing and exporting, but sharing data with customs brokers, with
precisely,
agents.
And we see that a lot in at least I see it a lot, and I'm sure Shopify deals with that too in terms of financial transaction processing. There's a lot of legalities for different borders, not just the US and Canada, like within Europe as well and across different continents. And again, the only way you can solve these problems, because if I'm a payment processor company and I'm focused on the US, that's my main market. I'm not really interested in the Canadian market or any other markets for that matter. I have my clients, I know my business size, that's what I'm focused on. But that also, by being open about my data and allowing API access to my platform, other companies can now come in and they can actually make my business more successful by enabling my business to work for other legalities, other systems. And in the case of the example of financial institutions, there's plenty of those systems where if you want to have an e-commerce experience online and you want to accept payments from around the world, because let's face it, we are a world economy now, I as the vendor or I as the merchant selling my information, I don't have to deal with any of that stuff. There's a list of companies that have already built systems that integrate well together that allow that to happen, so that somebody from, let's say, the Ukraine can buy a product from a company in Canada that runs its e-commerce system from a company in the US. Me as the vendor, I don't have to deal with any of that, and that's all thankful to API technologies.
I have a little bit of a, I agree with everything you guys have said, but I have a little bit of a different perspective on the standardization bit. Magento and Shopify may not get together and create a standard today, but the traditionally what has happened is that there has been a standard for most every technological advancement. And once that kind of, in the beginning, everything's a Wild West, and everyone wants their technology and their intellectual property to be the predominant sayer in what the standard is going to be. But as things mature, vendors come together, they find that common ground. And again, in the product space and things like that, it happens quickly. But on the policy side,
it's a little bit slower.
I don't think it happens. So, that's the only tweak I would say I have on kind of the standardization of APIs going forward. Because I know we're talking about in the healthcare side, banking, finance side, and things like that. It has happened to a certain degree, and it's just evolving.
For sure, and then the whole idea is to be able to streamline the movement of people, the movement of goods, and the technology tools are out there.
Can I just make a quick point about that? I love that you took it there, because this also comes back to the role of legislation and government. Businesses left to their own means may or may not come to that conclusion, but this is where government can become very useful in terms of enabling that sort of business, and this is where legislation can be very useful in actually driving the economical factor of having standardization and companies coming together to agree on standards and process, because it is the benefit of the entire community, not just the one business.
Ryan, you want to comment in terms of how you've seen in your career the need to harmonize and streamline?
Yeah, so cross-border trade's a great example of the need to standardize, and regulatory agencies have standardized the information that they require to admit a product. Importers know that, they know what they have to send. But where GS1 comes in and where industry has asked us to play is around the idea of using infrastructure, using data that already exists. And primarily we're talking about master data, data that has a pretty good shelf life relative to the product. So if you're importing a shipment of soup, cans of soup, Health Canada would require, say, 13 data points associated with that to make an import decision. As it currently stands right now, there's electronic processes to submit your import form, but in many cases, most importers or brokers are actually rekeying in that data or doing it manually each time. So where we're looking at is taking this registry of data that lives around the world, and the best example of how that's being used is a company like Alibaba, who's now the largest online retailer, largest food retailer in the world. they're picking cherries from trees in Washington State, and it's arriving on a consumer's plate in rural China within 24 hours. That's fueled by supply chain data. That's fueled by product data. So in the same way that they're automating their processes to do that, we're looking at ways to use this product registry that has been standardized around the world by manufacturers and their trading partners, and using it to very nearly automate or certainly improve upon the current process of submitting cross-border import declarations. So the standardization of it all is huge. What's unique about product identification standards are they have been adopted around the world. The GS1 standards are in use in over 150 countries worldwide. So there's no dispute or disagreement around which standards we use. It's now about finding the most efficient and best way to use the data and the investments that manufacturers have already made.
Any questions from the audience at this point? Or okay, so what role, and you sort of touched upon it, does government end up playing, right? And how do we, and I'll ask each one of you kind of for your thoughts, is this something that the industry has to be very vocal about? And how do we engage? Where do you see, because there's a big disconnect. Obviously, technology is at warp speed, government, not so much.
I think government has to be open. The first thing they have to do is be open to innovation. Anytime you talk about big data, the first thing that comes to mind is privacy issues. There are really smart people that have thought about it and found solutions to those concerns. An example is permanent residency cards. We worked with Citizenship and Immigration Canada to program all new permanent residency cards with an RFID chip and a GS1 standard. So as that permanent resident approaches a customs booth for re-entry back into the country, their documents are being automatically read as they approach it. So the customs agent already knows who that person is by the time they approach it. So customs has done that, but they're reluctant to move forward with passports. There's no rationale for it. The privacy concerns should be the same for both documents, but we've been slow on the uptake of that. So, if I had to key in on one thing, it's being open to trying new things, whether it's in pilot stages. CBSA has a really neat kind of test lab that they probably don't utilize to the full extent that they should. But go out and try these things. Try new areas of innovation. Try new data sources. Find ways to make it easier for people to do business across borders.
Cool. Rohit, you want to give some words of advice? One key word of advice.
I don't think I have any words of advice. I wouldn't be so presumptuous to give government officials advice at this stage. But one thing I can highlight that we're struggling with is we have over 250,000 patients across Canada being managed on one of our healthcare platforms, and we would love to collaborate with the counterparts in the U.S. And it's an infinite loop. We've been trying to study this for about 7-8 months, and we have absolutely no idea on how to even begin that process. And this is for particular groups of patients, some with genetic disorders, some with chronic illnesses. And in Canada, we're showing that the patients, in the way that they're being managed in Canada, are actually seeing better care and longer life. But getting that at least that collaboration going with the United States, there's just no agency for it. I mean, the other trade commissioners and things like that, but it's just kind of, go knock on that door, maybe they'll know something, go knock on the other door, then maybe they'll know something.
So better collaboration is...
Collaboration, and also, I mean, when we talk about the healthcare data, I mean, it is incredibly, locked down to a point where, a packet of data that's stored in Canada that has health information, one packet cannot come into the U.S.
Physically?
And that's physically. So what that actually does on the ground for us is it quadruples our hosting costs. And that's not great use of money.
Instead of focusing on the problem, it's the risk.
Yeah, so I don't know how to solve that problem. I just don't know how to solve it. It's not, that's not something that I've had enough experience with. And from the sounds of it, I don't know who here has that problem, has that solution either.
You want to comment?
Similar, or at least more extensive on that last point. I've talked to lawyer friends of mine. I know nothing about the legal system or laws in general, but I talked to a number of lawyer friends of mine and I keep asking them about the IP laws and technology laws and how do these things come to me, because for technologists and people in the technology industry, we look at these things and they don't make any sense. Like that example of a bit of information, zeros and ones, cannot physically live inside the border of the US if it's for a Canadian patient or a Canadian resident. That means nothing to us in technology. I'm sure there are some legal roots and reasons where that kind of surfaced. And the joke that my lawyer friend told me is that, yeah, back in the day when we needed to start, the software technology law practices and putting together the laws for it, we just copy pasted from the book industry and the publishing industry. And that's why when you read about like legislation or laws that are relating to software industry, you read about things like pages and documents, and that's how they refer to the digital information, which is not an accurate representation of it. But if there is one thing government can do to facilitate cross-border collaboration, especially at least for technology sector, it is to readdress these laws and regulations that have been put in place from historical. I'm sure there's been historical reasons for them. There might have been in the past century or two, you actually had documents that are actual papers in a file cabinet somewhere, and there's a law that says you cannot take that piece of paper from a file cabinet and move it across the border. That seems to be obvious, but in the case of bits and bytes, it's not the same thing. You can actually customize that law and go deeper and say, look, there's information that can be safely shared. Like we can share information about statistical information, for example. That's useful, that's helpful. People can actually leverage that. But the laws are really where things have not been moving at all across the border.
Last word.
Sure, yeah, and I think this is a good way to tie things together. You asked earlier about some of the trends in technology, and then also some of the biggest opportunities for government collaboration to improve, not just sectors on both sides of the border, but also the quality of life in millions of people. It's personalized medicine. A portfolio company of mine, S.A.G.E Health, with technology from Mayo Clinic and Cincinnati Children's Hospital, really pioneered the concept. This is going to be a mouthful of combinatorial pharmacogenomics, which what they do is they take a cheek swab, a healthcare provider takes a cheek swab, sends it to S.A.G.E. Within 36 hours, they get a red light, yellow light, green light report of optimal psychiatric medications based on multiple factors within the patient's genetic makeup. And they can only do this with huge sets of data because they've got algorithms that mine these different factors against longitudinal data sets. And just recently, a couple years ago, the company was formed, I think, in 2005, and it took them almost 10 years to get north of the border. So a couple years ago, they formed a partnership with the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto, and and now they're able to provide these same services to improve quality of life in millions of patients in Ontario. But in order to do that, they had to set up a Canadian subsidiary, and I think it's due to the laws about the data crossing the border. And you look at how rare it is for any kind of a startup that now is over close to 300 employees, but started in a old karate studio in a strip mall. You look at the probability of them lasting long enough and building the credibility and resources to be able to form a foreign subsidiary and to set up that kind of a partnership, and it's pretty rare. So I wonder what other technological innovations that can improve not just commerce but quality of life are kind of being hindered by some of these somewhat arbitrary restrictions.
Very good. So on that note, I want to thank you guys. It's been a great discussion that we've had. And I want to thank you guys for participating.